Hello, I'm Nan Simonson, and I go live. I was going to say almost every Tuesday, but on Tuesdays, usually at 1:30 Pacific Standard Time, and I'm so glad you're here or viewing this at another time. It is September 28th at 1:30 Pacific Daylight Time, and I am about to talk about sugar's secret. And it's something I didn't know. We think we know a lot about sugar, but I think there's something you may be interested in that may have something to do with maybe periods in your life, and maybe it's now, where you felt that sugar had a bit too much control over. I see a piece of hair here. I'm trying to straighten out over your behavior. And let's talk about what I mean by that. Um, do you love sweets? Do you enjoy a, I'll call it a refined sweet, as opposed to the sweets of an apple? Are you more um, drawn in by the sweets of an apple fritter? What about the flavor of, let's stick with fruit leather? Um, a little sweeter, a little more dense, but how about instead of that, the taste of an apple pie? We get drawn in by the super sweet things for a reason that I think you'll agree with me has been an assumption forever. As a matter of fact, for hundreds of years, we think and have thought that we love sweets because of what? Because of the way they taste, because of their flavor. And that would make sense. Tastes really good. I'm going to eat some. Ooh, it tastes so good. I think I'll just keep eating it. Or when I want a treat, I'll treat myself to something that makes me smile broadly rather than just maybe slightly satisfies me. Well, new things have come to light. And some of us aren't too concerned about how sweets affect us because some of us can regulate our behavior with them a little better than others. There was um, some research done, and I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies, but I'm going to tell you who I follow and whom I'd like to recommend you consider um, taking advantage of his knowledge in this subject and the podcast that even though I listen to him all the time, and his podcasts are in many cases an hour and a half to 2.5 hours or more, I want to recommend this particular one for this particular subject. The speaker is a professor at Stanford University who has his own lab. It's Dr. Andrew Huberman. And the podcast that I'm listening to is podcast 11, and it's How Foods and Nutrients Control Our Moods. So, how foods and nutrients control our moods. Huberman Lab podcast. You can Google that, just say video, Andrew Huberman, how foods and nutrients control our moods, and you'll get the lowdown on this. Before you do that, I am going to say that there are, um, I recommend him all the time. I think he's brilliant and he's interesting, and he covers subjects that I find fascinating. I'm a health coach, lifestyle medical health coach, integrative nutrition health coach, a plant based nutrition certified coach, and I am always interested in behavior. Well, when he spoke about this subject, I was particularly interested because I work with people trying to reduce blood sugar and their relationship with foods and how it affects them in their overall health. And uh, we see a lot of trouble, a lot of problems in our society now with obesity, um, glucose regulation, insulin resistance, and then the things that manifest from their cardiovascular disease, um, strokes. Um, it just goes on and on, but I'll kind of leave it at that. And so let me get back on subject. So he broke down in this podcast something, again, that I hadn't known. He was talking about dopamine, and he uh, is a professor of neurobiology and of ophthalmology, because our eyes are part of our brain. They reside outside of the skull, but they are part of the brain. And they just bring information into the eyes. Well, there are other things that bring information into the brain, and vice versa. We have something called a vagus nerve that begins at the brain stem, goes down even into parts of and most of our digestive system, and there is a feedback loop from the brain to the gut and the gut back to the brain through this vagus nerve. Well, he was talking about a set of neurons. They're cells, but they're neurons and neurotransmitters in our stomach that light up and are affected by sugar in our stomach. Super sweet things in our stomach will light up. These neurons send a message to the brain that raises dopamine. Now, in his conversation, before he started talking about sugar, he described what dopamine is. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. A lot of neurotransmitters are produced in our gut, which is the microbiome. And one of the things that affects our microbiome is what they eat. And the only thing those bacteria and different kinds of organisms in our gut, 80 trillion? I've heard 40, I've heard 60, I've heard 100, but it's about 3 pounds of material in there that they're now calling the new organ. The microbiome creates short chain fatty acids. It's fed these microbes. They are fed by the fiber in our food. And so I'm very much interested in what anyone has to say about the resulting, I'll call it metabolites, that food will affect. Well, one of the things I didn't realize, and this doesn't even go down to the microbiome, even though there's microbiome everywhere in us, in our mouth, on our skin, the greatest population in our colon, but it's everywhere, is that we had neurons in our stomach that registered sugar. The registering of it brings as I said, the message to our brain to produce dopamine. Now, what is dopamine? One of those neurotransmitters that to a large extent, 70 to 80% of neurotransmitters are created in our gut, but they make their way to our brain. Well, one of them you're familiar with, serotonin, is kind of a feel-good neurotransmitter. It settles us down. When we hear about dopamine, we say all the time, oh, well, that just raised his dopamine, meaning that made him feel good, not to settle us down and to quiet us, but that it was a reward transmitter. And that's what dopamine is. It's a neurotransmitter that lights us up in our reward circuitry. But there's something more to it. It also leads us to action. It drives us to look for more. It makes us want to do whatever it takes to get that hit again and again and again. That's why so many street drugs can be so dangerous, because it hijacks our dopamine receptors and lights them up. And yet, in most cases, every time they're lit up, the next time it takes a little more, and the next time it takes a little more. Well, that's the case with sugar as well, because all of the dopamine response is similar in that the first bite of something it makes us want more and more, but after a while we don't taste it the same, but we keep wanting more because we're looking for that first hit. Well, so dopamine is the reward and the driving factor in our neurotransmitters. If that's the case with sugar, what is that telling us? That's telling us that we're not just eating sugar because, or sweets, I'll leave it at that, sweets. We're not just eating sweets because they taste good. We're eating sweets because our body tells us to find them. The problem is you can't get away from sweets as easily as you think you can. I became aware of how detrimental sweets were to us. Pure sugar, in other words, manufactured, refined foods especially. The sugars in fruit, in grains, in because there's sugars in everything. The sugars of a date, but there's also the sugars in oats and the sugars in vegetables. But those are all wrapped up in fiber and in phytochemicals, phytonutrients, proteins, fats. All of those bind those and make their effect much smaller, and in some case they just slide on through and they aren't even detected. Well, refined sugars especially are detected easily because they're picked up by these neurons. They go straight to the dopamine center, the head lights up, and we want more. Well, what can that do to us if we're not aware of where that sugar comes from? Because we can make a decision, which I have. I had an eating disorder for, well, most of my adult life, and I don't ever want to go back to that kind of a situation again. And even though it's been 3 years and I haven't acted upon it, I know that I stay away from the things that are what we call not we, actually, Dr. Doug Lyle, if you follow his work, he is ancestral, it's not called ancestral, what is it called? Psychologist. Oh shoot, it'll come to me. But what he does is he looks at our evolutionary psychologist, and as he would say, our brains are lit up by things, especially things that we're not used to, that are so hyper palatable that we don't know what to do with it, except to, again, because of that dopamine circuitry, go back for more and more and more, because evolutionarily we were designed to go for the richest, most not filling as much as most dense, calorie dense foods that we can, because it kept us alive. Well, we don't have shortages of food. We don't have to splurge on something that's hyper palatable. But what makes something hyper palatable? Things that didn't come together in nature, that we're never used to, like salt, oil, and sugar all in one food. Well, guess where we get combinations like that? Well, we make them. We make them when we make cakes and cookies and things. So if you've attended any of my classes on YouTube or any of my podcasts, you're going to see that the recipes that I offer are whole food plant-based, and I'm whole food plant-based. You could call that vegan, but not if I'm wearing leather, and I have leather still around. So I'm whole food plant-based, but I stay away from refined sugars. The sugars that I use, I can make brownies, great chocolate brownies, that are cocoa powder, which is a whole, actually fermented organic cacao. Make it out of dates, make it out of sweet potatoes, and make it out of black beans, and they're fabulous. Well, that doesn't hit you like a brownie that I walk into a bakery and get, that's loaded with sugar, loaded with salt, loaded with oil, loaded with eggs. It's a very different kind of a hit. Well, the problem with refined foods and the problem with most foods that we get now are the hidden sugars. They are in everything. When you, I should have brought something to show you. When you look at the back of a package and do this, and by the way, while it's in my head, French fries have no business having anything in them other than a potato, and then unfortunately the cruddy oil that is used to fry them, and then the salt that is poured on to make them so, again, hyper palatable that we don't want to stop eating them. But do you know that McDonald's fries have sugar in them? There are a number of manufacturers that put sugar in French fries. Why? Because there's this tiny little bit that creates sort of a bliss point. And now it's easier to understand why some of us, some people, can't stop eating something, because when we get that nagging feeling, that almost physiological requirement to go out and get more, because that dopamine hit makes us feel good, but in the meantime it leaves us just scavenging for things almost as if it's an imperative. We don't even know why, because we don't know where those hits came in. So you look at a bottle of ketchup, and instead of tomatoes with a tiny bit of salt and probably nothing more, some tomato ketchups have fruit juice in them. I buy one that has a fruit juice in it. Most manufactured ketchup is not only full of sugar, but it also is full of the corn syrup. The corn syrup, meaning the high fructose corn syrup, hits you even to a greater degree than refined sugar does. It absolutely locks you in. Well, look at the packaging on almost any manufactured food you have. There'll be sugars in. Oh, you could pick up a bag of peas, frozen corn, and look at the back. And when they're outlining the what's in it, there will be sugars because that's natural sugars. But then you look at added sugar, and that's the sugar that they put in that is not naturally part of it. Keep in mind that 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon of granulated sugar. 4 grams of sugars added. My husband and I were in the market, and we do this all the time. I do it because I get compulsive about it. And I showed him, I don't know what it was, but it shouldn't have been a super sweet food. Oh, doesn't matter. And we looked at it, and it was 16 grams of sugar. Well, added sugar. How many teaspoons of at 4 grams per teaspoon was in there? 4 teaspoons of sugar. So one serving, this was a serving, wasn't even that many calories, but one serving was like eating, and you wouldn't have known this, you wouldn't have seen it, was like eating 4 teaspoons of table sugar. Who would ever do that? And yet innocently you can buy things that will leave you believing that you're doing healthy things for the family. Well, this is only ketchup. These are protein bars. These are veggie chips loaded with fat, loaded with oil, but even sugars in them. So if you're thinking, well, I can just avoid those things, I can taste when things are super sweet, here's something, or that of course I'm going to want to eat this way because it tastes so good. It's hard to go without the flavors. Well, an experiment was done, and the experiment was that the taste buds on the tongue were numbed, so nobody could taste anything. And these were researchers that at it might have been his lab, I don't know, one of the universities, and they numbed the taste buds, and then they blindfolded the people, and then they fed them, and they told them that they were getting actually, I don't even think they told them what they were getting. It didn't even matter. No, I don't think they told them what they were getting. You would hear it on his podcast. The people, when they, or maybe they did, it doesn't matter. I'm going to leave it alone. But at the end, the people who had the sweets, the whatever it was that they were eating that was sugary, that they could not taste, wanted more and more and more. The people who couldn't taste the food that didn't have sugar in it left it alone. They were just fine. They were satisfied. So what that says to us is even when we can't taste why we want something, we may want it because it's hijacked our dopamine reward system, which means that, and I hear people say, "Oh, I'm a sugar addict," and some professionals will say, "Well, there's no such thing." If there's such thing as someone becoming addicted to a drug or a behavior that rewards them, bing, 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 and draws them in and hijacks almost their free will. That's an exaggeration and rather dramatic, but kind of. That's an addiction. Whether it's a clinical addiction or not, that's an addiction. And there are people that say, "Oh, well, I'm addicted to sweets." I was listening to a physician who was doing a podcast, and he was a preeminent he's a surgeon, and he was teaching meditation, and he said, "I just love sweets. I could eat them all day long." And I had already heard Dr. Huberman's talk, and I thought, do you know what you're talking about? You don't even know this, because unless you had heard of this study, unless you know of this relatively new research that identifies neurons in the stomach that tell the brain to release dopamine, you wouldn't think it was that. You would just think, "Oh, it's that I don't have discipline. If I see a sweet thing, I want it," without understanding that you may not have seen a sweet thing. You may not have tasted a thing that tasted sweet to you, and yet the sugar in that food will make you want that food again and again and again. Isn't that interesting? Let me make sure I've told you everything I wanted to. Let's see. So what we're trying to do in our country is we're trying to improve the health of our population, and yet there are, unfortunately, in the average meal, whether you buy it from takeaway or you get processed food, you in many cases have no idea what's in there, but you can trust that there are sugars, many of which you can't even identify on the jar. Maltose, what is that? That's a sugar. And so you look and you say, "Well, I don't really see a lot of sugars on the label that identifies ingredients." It's because they have so many you don't even recognize. And in some cases, they don't have to show it as a sugar. When they say added sugars, you won't even know it's that. They'll show it as a carbohydrate, which is sort of a catch-all. All right. I think that's about all I wanted to say. What I found really interesting, and if you do listen to Dr. Huberman, and I respect him and I admire him, there are times when I will sort of yell at the screen, "Tell them about this, tell them about that." He also in this talked about the omega-3s and how we have to bring back in balance our omega-3 with our omega-6 ratio. They are, the omega-3s are the long-chain fatty acids that they are essential fatty acids. We can't make them, but they're required by the body to function. Omega-3 especially is essential for nerve production and nerve health, as well as our brain health and our heart. And it can be dominated and overridden by omega-6s. The omega-6s are inflammatory. The omega-3s are actually protective. Well, in our standard American diet, the omega-6s far outweigh the omega-3s. And he was saying we need to bring this back together. Where do the 3s come from? The 3s will come in from, if you're a whole food plant-based person, from nuts, especially walnuts, from seeds, especially flax and chia, and from greens and vegetables at a lesser amount. We can get omega 3s from fish, but I don't eat fish now because I, well, the oceans are so heavily polluted that I can get a wild caught salmon, but I'm still getting a lot of garbage. I can get salmon oil. Well, I'm not going to do that. But even that, unless it has been, it doesn't matter where they caught it. The oceans are an amalgam of water. Um, Unless they are actually filtering out the heavy metals and the chemicals, um, those products can still be heavily contaminated. I personally use an algae oil to help boost my omega 3s, but I get plenty, I'm sure, because I've been tested from my the flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, and my greens. But I just take it sort of as an insurance policy. Well, and he was saying, so I want to say to everyone, he doesn't tell you what to do as it relates to medicine or health. He says, I am a scientist, I am a professor, I'm simply telling you what the possibilities here. And he said, we should all be taking, I take an additional 1,000 milligrams of omega 3s. And he acknowledged the difficulty in finding a clean source. And I'm yelling at the phone, no, just eat less omega 6. Where does the 6 come from? In our food chain, the 6s come from processed foods because all processed foods are loaded with processed oils, and the oils, not so much in um, olive oil, but still to a degree, but especially in all of the other processed oils, and all oils are processed. Olives might be pressed, but they are still processed. It takes pounds and pounds to get this tiny bit of oil, and you leave behind the fiber and the nourishment and the phytonutrients and phytochemicals. But the omega 6s that we're getting in our population, 26s to 1, 3, 36s to 1, 3. That is typical of our population. Again, 6s, highly inflammatory. Why are we such a mess physically as a population? We're so out of balance. And in that way, as much as I appreciate and admire things he says, I was disappointed that he didn't say cut back on, but he doesn't do foods. He's a neurobiologist. He pretty well sticks with that. I wanted him to take on the food part and say eat less 6. And he could have done the same thing personally. Eat less 6, cut out the processed foods, increase your omega 3s in foods, and then see if you need to then take a pill. I follow the people I follow: T. Colin Campbell, Caldwell Esselstyn, Dr. McDougall. They all say the same thing: get it from your food. It's the food, it's the food, it's the food. That would be Dr. Clapper. Because they are whole food, plant based people who have been around decades and decades and decades, and their own personal health shows for it as well. So I hope you found this interesting. To me, this was a revelation. I had no idea that we had neurons in the stomach that were receptors for sugar and went right up to the brain and shot out some dopamine. We're had if we live on sugary foods, if we eat processed things and don't know where they're coming from. We will always be on the search, on the lookout. We'll always be wanting those kinds of foods, and it would make it very hard for most people to adopt a more plant-centered diet, because if we want the sweets and these things aren't, we won't feel satisfied. So be aware, be informed, consider what we eat every time we eat it. And I think that's it. I'll always remind you that I have a book that will help you make great decisions about aging with power. You could be 20, 30, 40, 50. We're all living toward our ultimate end, and we can do that ultimate end in power if we make the right decisions. And food has a lot to do with it, as do other things that I outline powerfully, the word being an acronym for 10 medical modalities, lifestyle modalities that can make the difference. So consider aging powerfully and have a great day, because I know I'm going to. If you've left any comments, I don't know why anymore, and I say this every time. I haven't figured this out, but I'll go back and I'll answer comments later. Okay, have a great day. Bye bye.